Yeah, this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing reading Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. We're picking up from page 336 of the translation. And so we're on the part on collective individuation, the first chapter of that part. We're going to finish that chapter today and start on the next chapter. And so we're getting to the end of the book. We just have the next chapter is a short one, and then the conclusion, and that's the end of volume 1 of the book itself. And then we have the different annexes in the next part of the book in volume 2. So what we saw last time was Simondon's criticism of what he considers to be two sort of opposite errors in looking at the collective and the relationship between the collective and the individual. So these two errors are what he calls psychologism and sociologism. And so he sets out these two errors in relation to this idea of in-groups and out-groups, or group interiority groups and exteriority groups. The idea of in-group and out-group is probably familiar or relatively straightforward, but the idea is that there's, in any sort of collective or any society, you have a certain set of people that you consider to be sort of one of us, or to belong to the same in-group as you, and then everyone else is outside of that group, and that forms the out-group. And for Simondon, these two errors of psychologism and sociologism are two ways of sort of collapsing the distinction between in-group and out-group and their relations to the individual. So in psychologism, there's an assimilation of the in-group to the individual. You treat the in-group as sort of an extension of the individual, and rather than something that has its own sort of proper reality. And then in sociologism, on the other hand, you treat the in-group as a sort of smaller model of an out-group. You assimilate the in-group to an out-group, and you treat society or the social as a substantial reality. And then the individual sort of is subordinated to society as a whole. And so for Simondon, we have to start from the intermediate level, but that doesn't mean necessarily, it doesn't mean something like a social psychology or psychosociology or something like that, like a mixture of the two. But we start from the individuation process of the formation of groups. So in the individual, there's something that is not individuated, this pre-individual reality that remains within the individual. The individuals are capable of undergoing a further process of individuation and individuating as a group. And so we have to start from that reality of the individuation of the group, and then the psychology and sociology, so the individual behavior and the group, the society. Those two extremes are sort of endpoints of the process of individuation of a group. And so this distinction between in-group and out-group is one that is actually a sort of relative distinction, or in the sense that all groups are both in-group and out-group, but there's a sort of preponderance of one side over the other, so that some groups are more in-group than out-group, and others are more out-group than in-group. And there's also a sort of dynamics of this process, because groups begin as in-groups, and as they develop and expand and sort of become institutionalized over time, they become more like an out-group and more sociological rather than psychological. It's this process that we have to look at for Simondon, rather than starting from society and then asking how the individual is inserted into the society, or starting from the individual and then asking how the individual forms groups, or how individuals come together to form groups. So that's the main piece of what we saw last time. So we can get started on this reading. So I'll read the first, let's see, I think these are short sections. Well, this one's a bit longer, so I'll read a page or so and then you can pick up from there. Right, so subsection 7, group individuation and vital individuation. It is possible to investigate the signification of social reality with respect to the living individual. Can we speak of individuals living in society, i.e., can we suppose that individuals would be individuals even if they didn't live in society? The example of animal species shows us that there are cases in which the life of the solitary individual is possible. In other cases, periods of solitary life alternate with periods of collective life. Finally, in a number of cases, life is almost always social, except in some extremely rare moments, courtship, mating. Should it then be said that sociality resides in the species and is a part of specific characteristics? If this proposition is admitted, we will have to consider an individual that is not integrated into a social group in a generally social species as an unaccomplished, incomplete individual that does not participate in the system of individuation that the group is. If, on the contrary, the group is formed by beings that could be complete individuals by themselves, the isolated individual is not necessarily incomplete. However, the response to this question seems contained in the morphology and physiology of the species. When a morphological and functional specialization intervenes and models individuals to the point of making it improper for them to live in isolation, sociality would be defined as one of the characteristics of the species. The bee or the ant is necessarily social because it only exists as a very specialized individual in its inability to live alone. On the contrary, in the species where there is no extremely clear differentiation between individuals that makes them incomplete by themselves, the necessity of social life belongs less directly to the specific characteristics. According to ecology or other conditions, temporary isolated life arises or halts. The group can be intermittent. The group is then a mode of behavior of the species relative to the milieu or to other species, rather than the expression of the imperfect and incomplete character of the individual being. This is generally the type of existence for societies of mammals. For man, the problem is more complex. There is the somatic and functional independence of the individual as in other mammals. There is both the possibility of a somewhat grouped life and a somewhat solitary life, which is the consequence of this somatic and functional completion of the individual. In these conditions, there can be groupings that correspond to a mode of behavior relative to the milieu. Marx interprets the characteristic association of labor in this sense. But it seems that in addition to this somatopsychic individuation that permits independence or association on the level of specific behaviors, the human being still remains unachieved, incomplete, evolving individual by individual. There is no specific behavior that is sufficient for corresponding to this becoming that is so strong that, while having a somatopsychic achievement at least as perfect as that of other animals, man resembles a very incomplete being. It is as if, above a first specific individuation, man sought another individuation and required two individuations consecutively. Recognized as living in the world, man can associate together to exploit the world, but something is still lacking for man. There is still a void to fill, something that has yet to be accomplished. Exploiting nature alone is not enough for man. The species facing the world is not an interiority group. Another relation is required to make each man exist as a social person, and for that to come about, there must be the second genesis, i.e., the group individuation. After having been constituted as a complete being, man once again enters into a calling of incompletion in which he seeks a second individuation. Nature or man face to face with nature are not enough. There still remain forces and tensions that go further than the group face to face with nature. This is why man thinks of himself as a spiritual being, and to a certain degree, the notion of spirit is perhaps mythical, insofar as it leads to the substantialization of the spirit and to a somatopsychic dualism. In addition to functional groups, which are like animal groups, or in addition to the functional tenor of groups, there is something hyperfunctional in groups, specifically their interiority. This interiority creates the human individual a second time, recreates him through his existence as an already biologically individuated being. This second individuation is the group individuation, but it is not at all reducible to the second group, i.e., the exploitation of nature by associated men. This group, which can be called an action group, is distinct from the nothing moreover proves that human groups are the only ones to possess the characteristics we define here. It could be that animals include a certain coefficient that corresponds to them that corresponds to what we are seeking as the basis of spirituality in human groups, albeit in a more transitory, less stable, and less continual way. In this opposition of human groups to animal groups, here we are not taking animals as being veritably what they are, but as responding, perhaps fictitiously, to what is the notion of animality for man, i.e., the notion of a being that has relations regulated by the character. It is then possible to call the human social group a group whose basis and function would be a specific adaptive response to nature. This would be the case for a labor group that would be nothing but a labor group, if such a thing could be realized in a pure and stable manner. Social reality thus defined would remain on the vital level. It would not create the relation of group interiority unless one accepts the Marxist schema of the conditioning of superstructures by the... Right, so here we have some different possibilities for the relationship between the individual and the group. So there are certain animals that are solitary in general. So the individual doesn't have any relation to other individuals for most of its lifespan. There are other animals that live in a society, but they do so in the sense of they are involved in a society in a way that requires some sort of physiological adaptation to that society. So the case especially of social insects like bees and ants and termites. So the different roles within these insect societies have physiological specializations. And then there's also the case of animals that live in societies but that don't have physiological specializations for those societies. And so this is more often the case with mammals. You can look at chimpanzees or elephants or oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, so some elephants in West Africa are largely solitary. I did not know that. I know that other types of elephants live in groups and have a pretty intricate social structure. So yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know if it's I don't know if they're different species of elephants or if it's just like a sort of difference of different populations in terms of like what sort of social life they have. But yeah, so there's this variation of different possibilities of relations between the individual and the collective. And so the question for Simondon here is how to characterize the human relationship between the individual and the collective. And so on the one hand, of course, humans don't have a physiological specialization in the way that ants or bees do. So that type of society is excluded. But the other type of society, the mammalian society, in which you have individuals that are sort of physiologically self-sufficient and are associated in societies of individuals that are not specialized. This is also not quite what the human society or the human collective looks like either. There's a sort of incompleteness to the individual human being that Simondon points out here. So when you think of like someone who's shipwrecked and trapped on a desert island or something like that, like this is obviously not a normal case of human life or human flourishing or whatever term you want to use. This is a sort of accidental case and generally one that humans experience as being very painful and hard to live with. So the standard situation for humans, of course, is to live in a society and not not being in a society is something that most humans find hard to live with. So this character of incompleteness to the human being, or this felt need for society, is something somewhat different than the association of mammals, the more general association of mammals, and as a result of this, Simondon thinks that we can't define the groupings of human beings or collectivities of human beings in terms of the relationship between the human and external nature. And this is how he takes Marx's notion of labor to be understood. So this would be the human relationship to nature. Human beings appropriate natural substances and work on nature in various ways to produce goods that satisfy our needs. And so this picture of the human grouping of a labor group is the one that Simondon thinks is sort of misleading, because it doesn't seem to account for the necessity of grouping humans together. You can make some sort of argument that humans are associated, out of some sort of utility or something like that. That they find that working together is more efficient, or something like that. But it doesn't account for that incompleteness of the human being. And then there's a question about so associations based on labor are more mammalian than human for Simondon. Yeah, I think that's right. So in a sense, or if we understand labor in the sense of humans appropriating from nature, products that they need to satisfy their needs, or something along those lines. If we take labor to mean a relationship between the human and nature, then it would be something closer to these mammalian societies rather than a more properly human society in the way that Simondon understands it. But I think he's going to also suggest that we should understand labor not just as something, not just a relationship between humans and nature. Like he gives the example of a little bit later in this section of the surgeon. The surgeon performs labor in a sense, but not on external nature, but rather on a human being. Actually, I think that was in a previous section. But yeah, so he's going to sort of problematize that notion of labor as the relationship between human and yeah. So there definitely would be it would not be expected to find a group that would be associated purely based on labor. So yeah, like you pointed out here, the harvest festivals, it's a situation where you have some sort of labor-related I don't know, ceremony or occasion, but then there's also this trans-individual component, in that there's a religious aspect to these celebrations in many societies, and even maybe a simpler example is you find in any situation, or in many situations at least, where you have a group of workers, they come up with I don't know, things like work songs or some sort of pattern of working together that is not just sort of a utility maximizing operation or something like that. It's not just that they sort of associate together because it's a better way of appropriating products from nature. It's that they, in their work together, they have some sort of bond or social relationship to each other. So the labor is both a relationship to nature and to other human beings. So it has both aspects to it, and ultimately we shouldn't treat those aspects as like two separate aspects. The two sides are sort of joined together for Simone.
I can read the next page or so.
Yeah. I was just finding where we are again. Yeah, go ahead.
Are we at "but it is precisely"?
Yes.
Okay. But it is precisely a question of knowing if one can treat the other types of groups and the other contents of group life as superstructures with respect to this unique infrastructure. There are perhaps other infrastructures than the exploitation of nature by men in society, other modes of relation to the milieu, than those that pass through the relation of elaboration, i.e. through labor. The very notion of infrastructure can be critiqued. Is labor a structure, or indeed a tension, a potential, a certain manner of being connected to the world through an activity that calls for structuration without itself being a structure? If it is admitted that socio-natural conditionings are multiple on the specific level, it is difficult to extract one of these conditionings and to assert that it has the value of a structure. Perhaps Marx has generalized a real historical fact, i.e. the dominance of this mode of relation to nature, that labor is in the human relation to the 19th century. But it is difficult to find the criterion that allows for this relation to be integrated into an anthropology. The man who works is already biologically individuated. On the biological level, labor is like the exploitation of nature. It is a reaction of humanity as a species, a speciated reaction. This is why labor is so permeable to other interindividual relations. It does not have its own resistance. It does not produce a second, properly human individuation. It is defenseless. In himself, the individual remains a biological individual, a simple individual, a determined and already given individual. But above these biological, biologico-social, and interindividual relations, there is another level that could be called the level of the transindividual. This is what corresponds to interiority groups, to a veritable group individuation. The interindividual relation goes from individual to individual. It does not penetrate individuals. Transindividual action is what makes it such that individuals exist together as elements of a system that contains potentials and metastability, expectation and tension. Then the discovery of a structure and of a functional organization that integrate and resolve this problematic of incorporated imminence. The transindividual passes into the individual as though from individual to individual. Individual personalities are constituted together by overlapping and not by agglomeration or by a specializing organization, as in the biological grouping of solidarity and division of labor. The division of labor imprisons the biological unities, i.e. the individuals, into their practical functions. The transindividual does not localize individuals. It makes them coincide. It makes individuals communicate through significations. Relations of information are what is primordial, not relations of solidarity and functional differentiation. This coincidence of personalities is not reductive, for it is not founded on the amputation of individual differences or on their utilization toward ends of functional differentiation, which would imprison the individual in its particularities, but on a second structuration based on what the biological structuration that forms living individuals still leaves unresolved. It could be said that biological individuation does not exhaust tensions which have aided in its constitution. These tensions pass into the individual. They pass into the individual from the pre-individual, which is both milieu and individual. It is precisely based on this position of the unresolved in man, within this not yet individuated charge of reality, that man seeks out his fellow man to form a group in which he will find presence through a second individuation. In man, and perhaps also in animals, biological individuation does not fully resolve tensions. It leaves the problematic latent, subsistent. That is to say that life is that which carries spirit is not to express oneself correctly. For life is a first individuation, but this first individuation has not been able to exhaust and absorb all forces. It has not resolved everything. We have movement to go ever further, as Malebranche said. In fact, we have tension and potentials for becoming other, for recommencing an individuation that is not destructive of the first.
Right. So this bit is should be pretty familiar by now of his notion of this pre-individual reality that remains behind in individuation at the vital level, and allows for this collective individuation of the human to occur. And he also leaves open sort of the possibility that this occurs in other animals as well, which is interesting. And he 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 sort of clarifies earlier that when he talks about animals here, he's talking about a sort of mythological representation of animals as entities that are sort of governed by nature, and so this is a representation of what animality is for the human being, rather than what animality is as such. But yeah, so it's this this remainder of the pre-individual that sort of remains behind in the individuation process that serves as a foundation for the second individuation that takes place in the collective. And yeah, this is an interesting comment from Angus again. So I think it must be the case that not all action groups are interiority groups. If a criterion of the trans-individual is the preservation of individual differences. I think I think the interiority group is formulated in a way, or is structured in a way that it has this overlapping of personalities, as Simondon describes it here. So it incorporates the individuals, but it doesn't sort of subordinate them in the way that certain depictions of, like, society as a whole, as a sort of overarching principle that governs individuals. So individuals constitute the group at the same time as they are constituted by it. Um, um, so in connection with action groups, I think, well, I mean, all groups are both interiority groups and exteriority groups. So an action group would necessarily have to be an interiority group, but the question is whether it's sort of a predominance of interiority group over exteriority groups. And yeah, so I think that's right. I think we can have. I think when we talk about the trans individual, I don't think there's a sort of ethical decision built into that notion. So it doesn't mean that a group formed on the basis of this collective individuation that Simondon is talking about is necessarily going to be like a good group in some ethical sense or political sense, or any sort of normativity. I think it's possible to talk about, like, the collective individuation of the Nazi Party in 1930s Germany, for example, and the way that they, how the individuals were sort of incorporated into that group, and how the group was made up by those individuals. So I don't think the notion of collective individuation has this sort of normativity built into it. But yeah, that's an interesting question that Simondon doesn't really specify. Yeah. Let's see. Was there anything else to go over in this reading? I think it was relatively straightforward. Yeah, maybe actually one point is when he talks about this notion of superstructure and infrastructure, or superstructure and base. So this is a sort of classical Marxist set of concepts. So according to which there's the economic base of society is what determines in the last instance the different changes in the superstructure, so including legal relations and politics and ideology as the different domains of the superstructure. And so what this essentially means is that there's the economic base is made up of the productive forces and the relations of production. So there's both the actual direct appropriation from nature, and then there's also the social relations that make up the relations of production within the economic base. And then these are, in some sense, conditions for the political and legal relations in that society. And then ideology is a sort of further layer on top of those. And so Simondon criticizes this. Well, first, the idea that the relationship with nature would be the infrastructure. And then second, the idea that there is something like an infrastructure at all. And he suggests that labor, or the relationship between humans and nature in appropriating products from nature should be understood as a sort of structuring activity rather than a structure itself. So it's something that requires that brings about a structure rather than something that is itself a structure. And so this is, I think, just an instance of Simondon's general position of trying to treat categories genetically in terms of a genesis. So here, labor should be understood as something that brings about structure that constitutes the genesis of a structure rather than something that is a structure itself. So if that's the case, then we wouldn't be able to treat labor or the appropriation of products from nature as an infrastructure that would determine other aspects of society. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Let's see. We're at this force is not vital, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I can read the next bit. This force is not vital, it is pre-vital. Life is a specification, a first solution, complete in itself by leaving a residue outside its system. It is not as a living being that man carries him. Sorry, that man. There's a grammatical error here. It is not as a living being that man carries with him what individuates spiritually, but as a being that contains something pre-individual and pre-vital in it. This reality can be called transindividual. Its origin is neither social origin nor individual. This reality is deposited in the individual, carried by the latter, but it does not belong to the individual and is not a part of the individual's system of being. We should not speak of the individual's tendencies that carry it toward the group, for these tendencies are not, properly speaking, tendencies of the individual qua individual. They are the non-resolution of potentials that have preceded the genesis of the individual. The being that precedes the individual has not been individuated without remainder. It has not been totally resolved into individual and milieu. The individual has conserved the pre-individual with it, and all individuals together thus have a sort of unstructured ground based upon which a new individuation can occur. The psychosocial is transindividual. It is this reality that the individuated being carries, this charge of being for future individuations. This pre-vital charge should not be called élan vital, since it is not exactly in continuity with vital individuation, although it extends life, which is a first individuation. As a bearer of pre-individual reality, man encounters in others another charge of this reality. The emergence of structures and functions that can occur at this moment is not inter-individual, since it contributes a new individuation that is superposed on the older one and goes beyond it, linking several individuals into a group that is born. In this sense, it could be said that spirituality is marginal relative to the individual rather than central, and that it does not establish a communication of consciousnesses, but a synergy and shared structuration of beings. The individual is not just the individual, for it is also the being's reserve, which is not yet polarized, but which is available and lies in wait. The transindividual is with the individual, but is not the individuated individual. It is with the individual according to a more primordial relation than belonging, inherence, or the relation of exteriority. This is why it is a possible contact beyond the limits of the individual. To speak of the soul is to overly individualize and overly particularize the transindividual. The impression of surpassing individual limits and the opposite impression of exteriority that characterize the spiritual have a meaning and find the foundation of their unity of divergence in this pre-individual reality. The divergence of spirituality's transcendence and imminence is not a divergence within the transindividual itself, but a divergence with respect to individuated individual alone. Angus has posted a comment that there seem to be two transindividuals, the transindividual that is any interiority group and the transindividual that requires the ordeal of solitude and is characterized by sainthood, heroism, and the other one was wisdom. So maybe the second form of the transindividual corresponds to something like authentic being with in Heidegger and could be seen as a sort of normative standard. I think there's at least, whether we want to say there's two transindividuals or there's two sort of sides to the transindividual, because so there's the transindividual as something that is sort of the foundation for any interiority group, and is sort of widespread in the sense that it occurs throughout human social grouping. So there's that side or that aspect of the transindividual, and then there's also the transindividual that is this sort of rare formation of a collective individuation, and it requires this ordeal of solitude that he's described, so it seems like those two aspects of the transindividual have to be kept distinct on the one hand, but then also they shouldn't be taken as sort of independent either. Like in some way that Simondon doesn't really make clear, it seems that the second form of the transindividual, the one that is part of this experience of solitude and that is the property or the characteristic of these saints and heroes and sages. This notion of the transindividual seems to be in some way more fundamental or more authentic, is maybe the right word, as Angus put it in the chat there. There's something about it that grasps the transindividual in a way that is better or more a fuller way of grasping the transindividual, whereas in the more sort of widespread notion of the transindividual, it sort of is there but is not fully grasped or is not fully manifested or something like that. Yeah, so this is one point where Simondon doesn't really explain what the relation is between these two sides or these two aspects of and maybe I'll also mention briefly, so he in passing says that we shouldn't call this pre-vital charge or this pre-individual reality that remains with the individual. We shouldn't call it an élan vital. And this is a term from Bergson, who has this famous idea of evolution as being sort of driven by this force that sort of pushes life into specialization of different kinds, rather than being a purely mechanical process. There's a sort of something driving evolution forward for Bergson, and so Simondon, he says that we shouldn't use this term élan vital for this pre-individual reality because it's he says it's not exactly in continuity with vital individuation, although it extends life. So it's not. So the vital individuation captures a certain portion of this pre-individual reality and individuates out of it, but the collective individuation that we're talking about here is not just an extension of that first individuation. It's a new sort of descent into the pre-individual reality to form a new individuation. So you're individuating something more than what was individuated already in vital individuation. Yeah, and then this idea of how the being's reserve is not yet polarized, we can connect this back to the idea of emotion being the sense of or polarization of action in the trans individual. I think that's right. I think this notion of polarization is one that he comes back to in a few different levels or a few different domains. So yeah, in the case of emotion, but also when he talked about tropism in sensation. Sensation for Simondon is always a sort of orientation of the organism with respect to a polarization in its environment, and so this polarization is always a secondary phenomenon. It is a product of an individuation out of something pre-individual that is not yet polarized. So it's only in a second phase or a second step of the reality under discussion that something like a polarization appears. Yeah, and then the question about the interiority can also be the whole. I'm not sure if Simondon really wants to use the term whole. I think he wants to sort of keep this distinction between the in-group and the out-group. So there's always this sort of relativity of the collective. It's always an in-group for some out-group and an out-group for some other in-group. And so a notion of the whole would sort of require some sort of most external group, like if we talked about the whole or the sort of universal society, it would be something like a society that wouldn't have an out group. And I think for Simondon, this is something that we should avoid thinking of. And he also criticizes in an earlier passage this idea of a sort of universal society, or on the other side of it would be like the atom of society, so the individual without social. Yes, so he does mention these extreme cases like Saint Francis of Assisi, who for whom the the in-group expands to include all of creation. So even the animals are part of the in-group. So yeah, that might be a sort of exceptional case, but I think, yeah, I'm not sure how he would say how he would put it exactly, because the in-group should still be an out-group from another perspective or another side. But if the in-group expands to cover the whole of creation, then it's hard to see how it would also be. Okay, so let's go on to the next subsection, subsection 8, if someone else would like to read.
I can read again. Pre-individual reality and spiritual reality, the phases of being. The very notion of a psychosomatic unity is not completely satisfying, and we recognize this insufficiency of organismic theory without being able to say what it consists in. However, it in fact seems that the insufficiency consists in this overflowing of pre-individual reality with respect to the reality of the individual. The individual is only itself, but it exists as superior to itself, since it carries with it a more complete reality that individuation has not exhausted, and that is still new and potential, i.e., animated by potentials. The individual is aware of this fact of being linked to a reality that is over and above itself as an individuated being. Excuse me. With the mythological reduction, one can make of this reality a daimon, a spirit, genie, a soul. One then sees in it a second individual that doubles the first, watches over it and can constrain it, lives on after it as an individual. By accentuating the aspect of transcendence, one can also find in this same reality the testimony for the existence of a spiritual individual exterior to the individual. All these various expressions used for naming the spiritual reality are expressions the individual translates for consciousness and conduct, so as not to feel alone inside himself, to not feel limited as an individual to a reality that would be nothing but himself. The individual begins to participate by association within himself before any manifested presence of some other individuated reality. Starting from this first feeling of possible presence, the search begins for this second fulfillment of the being that reveals the transindividual to it by structuring this reality carried within the individual at the same time as other similar realities and by means of them. One can speak neither of the imminence nor transcendence of spirituality with respect to the individual. For the veritable relation is that of the individual to the transindividual. The transindividual is what is on the outside of the individual as well as inside him. In fact, the transindividual, insofar as it is not structured, traverses the individual. It is not in topological relation with the individual. Imminence or transcendence can only be said with respect to individuated reality. There is an anteriority of the transindividual relative to the individual that prevents defining a rapport of transcendence or imminence. The transindividual and the individuated do not concern the same phase of being. There is a coexistence of two phases of being, like the amorphous ice in a crystal. This is why the group can seem like a milieu. The group personality is constituted on a ground of pre-individual reality that includes, after structuration, an individual aspect and a complementary aspect of this individual. The group possesses an analog of the soul and an analog of the body of the individual being. But this soul and this body of the group are formed by the reality provided before any splitting by the individual beings. Collective consciousness is not formed by the joining of individual consciousnesses, no more than the social body arises from the joining of individual bodies. Individuals carry something that can become collective but is not already individuated in the individual. The union of individuals charged with non-individuated reality, bearers of this reality, is necessary for the individuation of the group. This non-individuated reality cannot be called purely spiritual. It splits into collective consciousness and collective corporeity as structures and limits that determine the individuals. The individuals are both animated and determined by the group. Purely spiritual groups cannot be created without bodies, without limits, or without attachments, like that which is individual. Like that which is individual, the collective is psychosomatic. If successive individuations become rare and less frequent, the collective body and the collective soul increasingly separate, despite the production of myths and opinions that keep them relatively paired together. Whence the aging and decline of groups, which consists in a detachment of the group soul from the group body. The social present is no longer an integrated present, but an erratic one. It becomes insular, detached, just as the awareness of the present in a person of old age is no longer directly linked to the body, is no longer inserted in the body, but sustains itself in an indefinite iteration. One can assert that there is a relation of the collective and the spiritual, but this relation is neither on the level of the inter-individual nor on the level of the natural social. If by natural social one means a collective reaction of the human species to the natural conditions of life, for example, through labor. The second paragraph seems to relate back to, I think it was either in the last reading or the one before that, where he suggested that the interiority group kind of perpetuates itself by adding the pre-individual share or incorporating the pre-individual share from new members. And maybe this description of the group soul detaching from the group body is what happens when that doesn't, process of the addition of something new doesn't happen.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I think he's bringing back this notion of phases of being that we saw in the introduction to this book many months ago now. So this is the idea of being the pre-individual being as above unity, and then the splitting of that pre-individual being into separate phases, and this trans-individual reality that appears in the human being is a sort of recollection of that pre-individual being, or it's the remainder of that pre-individual being that stays with the individual through its individuation, and I think you're right about that that second paragraph. But he's also bringing back here some of the stuff we saw a little while ago about imminence and transcendence, and how the trans-individual can't be described as either imminent to the individual or transcendent beyond the individual. So there's he says that we can't, the trans-individual is not in topological relation with the individual, so you can't say that it's either within or outside of the individual. It sort of traverses the boundary of the individual. And this notion of the soul and body of the group. There's a So the group has a psychosomatic reality in the same way as the individual does. So the individual has a psychosomatic reality, not in a sense that the individual consists of a soul and a body, but rather that there's this sort of immediately psychosomatic or somatopsychic reality, this intermediate level of reality that only sort of in extreme cases can turn into something purely somatic or purely psychical. And so likewise in the group, you would have this psychosomatic level or this psychosomatic reality, this immediately psychosomatic reality, as what is primary, and then only in sort of extreme cases you would end up with something like a soul of the group, separate from the body of the group, and he characterizes these extreme cases as being cases of a sort of degeneration or senility of a group. So a group can only remain youthful or vital in the sense of being like a living group that is still active. It can only remain vital in that sense by taking on the pre-individual reality of its members and undergoing a further process of individuation. Yeah, I think so we can connect this back to when he talks about evil as something outside of the individual. So this depiction of temptation by the devil or some sort of being outside of oneself. When you sort of give in to temptation, you find yourself in a different kind of register of reality that is not really translatable into the terms of the spiritual reality from before that temptation. So we can connect this with this notion of the trans individual not having a topological relation with the individual. So you can't say that binocular vision is either inside or outside of monocular vision. I think that's a good analogy or a good example. So that in binocular vision, we sort of incorporate monocular vision, but it's not something external to monocular vision. It's not a separate reality. So it's neither within nor without monocular. So let's go on to the next bit. Would anyone else like to read, or should I pick up again?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Already?
Yes. Yeah, that's where we are.
What makes use of already individuated reality, whether somatic or psychical, cannot define spirituality. Spiritual significations are discovered on collective individuation and the foundation of the trans individual. Like, is that a title, like, or part of the text? I guess it's a title. Sorry. The level of the trans individual, not on the level of the inter-individual or the social. The individuated being bears with it a possible future of relational significations to be discovered. The pre-individual is that which founds the spiritual and the collective. One could call nature this pre-individual reality that the individual bears with it by seeking to rediscover in the word nature the significations that the pre-Socratic philosophers gave it. The Ionian psychologists found in nature the origin of all types of being prior to individuation. Nature is the reality of the possible in the form of this apeiron, from which Anaximander makes every individuated form emerge. Nature is not the contrary of man, but the first phase of the being, while the second phase is the opposition of the individual and the milieu, the complement of the individual relative to the whole. According to the hypothesis presented here, apeiron would remain in the individual like a crystal that retains its mother liquor, and this charge of apeiron would allow it to go toward second individuation. However, unlike all the systems that grasp the collective as a joining of individuals and that think the group as a form for which individuals are the matter, this hypothesis would not make individuals into the matter of the group. Individuals bearing apeiron discover in the collective a signification which is expressed, for example, as the notion of destiny. The charge of apeiron is the principle of disparation relative to the other charges of the same nature contained in other beings. The collective is an individuation that joins the natures that are born by several individuals but not contained in the already constituted individualities of these individuals. This is why the discovery of the collective's signification is both transcendent and imminent relative to the interior individual. It is contemporaneous with the new group personality, in which the individual participates through the significations that he discovers through its nature, but this nature is not veritably the nature of its individuality. It is the nature associated with its individuated being. It is the persistence of the initial and original phase of the being in the second phase, and this persistence implies a tendency toward a third phase, which is that of the collective. The collective is an individuation of the natures linked to individuated beings. Through this apeiron that it carries, the being is not just an individuated being, it is the pair of the individuated being and of nature. Through this persistent nature, the being communicates with the world and with other individuated beings, discovering significations concerning which it does not know whether they are a priori or a posteriori. The discovery of these significations is a posteriori, for there must be an operation of individuation in order for these significations to appear, and the individuated being cannot accomplish this whole operation of individuation alone. A presence must be created with some other being than the individuated being alone in order for individuation, the principle and milieu of signification, to be able to appear. But this appearance of signification also supposes a real a priori, the link to the subject of this charge of nature, the persistence of the being in its original pre-individual phase. The individuated being is the bearer of an absolute true origin. Signification is the correspondence of the a priori and the individuation that come after the first. Example, the a posteriori individuation.
Right. So here he gives us a few different synonyms or other terms to use for this pre-individual reality. So he says we can call it nature, or this apeiron, and both terms are used in relation to pre-Socratic philosophy. So Anaximander has this notion of the indefinite apeiron, that everything definite, everything determinate is sort of solidified out of this indefinite, and so it's this notion of the indefinite, or the nature in this sense of something that is pre-individual that he is pointing to. Yeah, and so it's this pre-individual reality, this apeiron within the individual, or associated with the individual, that forms the basis for further individuation and the formation of a collective. So it's only because the individual has associated with it this charge of pre-individual reality that it can undergo collective individual. And then we have this interesting bit. It's just a little bit of a hint of it here, but yeah. So we have the this notion of a priori and a posteriori, and he doesn't use the term here, but we saw. I think I was in the introduction as well. he uses the term a presenti for this notion of the process of individuation and transductive processes in general as being a presenti. And so here he is, I think, sort of hinting towards that same idea that the process of individuation is neither a priori nor a posteriori. It's not something that we sort of bring with us to experience, and it's not something that we derive from experience. It's the actual process. It's the actual process of the experience itself. And then, but he says there is something, a real a priori, which is the pre-individual reality. So this is something that precedes the existence of the individual. Before any of us were formed, there was this pre-individual reality out of which we end up being formed. And so it's only because this pre-individual reality pre-exists the already formed individuals that those individuals are capable of having a relationship to the world around them and to other individuals. Yeah, and Angus has commented in the chat about how the section on reflexivity that we saw a few weeks ago, in that section he talks about the future and the past, and then this strange term, the dialectic, that he picks up in that section, and then the dialectic would be the a presenti, and this would be connected with the idea that knowledge requires the transindividual. So I think that's right. I think it's only because there's something. It's only because this pre-individual reality precedes our individual existence and the existence of the associated milieu that we can have knowledge of the world around us, or any relation to it at all, but knowledge in particular. So it's because, in this sense, the individual, the pre-individual reality is a real a priori rather than an a priori for knowledge alone. So this is what he means by calling it a real a priori. Okay, so let's go on to the next chapter, which is the last chapter of the book before the conclusion. So I can read the next page or so. Chapter 2, The Collective as Condition of Signification. Section 1, Subjectivity and Signification, the Transindividual Character of Signification. The existence of the collective is necessary for information to be significative. When the original charge of nature borne by individual beings cannot be structured and organized, there can be no form in the being for accommodating the form contributed by signals. To receive an information is in fact for the subject to carry out within itself an individuation that creates the collective rapport with the being from which the signal arises. To discover the signification of the message that stems from one being or several beings is to form a collective with them and individuate through the group individuation with them. There's no difference between discovering a signification and existing collectively with the being relative to which the signification is discovered, since signification is not of the being but between beings, or rather across beings. It is transindividual. The subject is the ensemble formed by the individuated individual and the apeiron that it carries along with it. The subject is more than individual. It is individual and nature. It is both phases of being at the same time. The subject tries to discover the signification of these two phases of being by resolving them in the transindividual signification of the collective. The transindividual is not the synthesis of the first two phases of being, since this synthesis could only occur in the subject in order to be rigorously synthetic. But the transindividual is nevertheless the signification of these two phases, since the disparation that exists between the two phases of being contained in the subject is enveloped within signification via the constitution of the transindividual. This is why it is absolutely insufficient to say that language is what allows man to access significations. If there were no significations to sustain language, there would be no language. Language is not what creates signification. It is merely what conveys between subjects and information, which, in order to become significative, must encounter this apeiron associated with the definite individuality in the subject. Language is the instrument of expression, the conveyance of information, but it does not create significations. Signification is a rapport of beings, not a pure expression. Signification is relational, collective, trans-individual, and it cannot be provided by the encounter of expression in the subject. We can say that information is based on signification, but we cannot say that there are innate psychosomatic structures and dynamisms that constitute a mediation between the natural, the pre-individual phase, and the individuated. Sexuality is one such mediation. In a sense, it could be said that the fact of being sexuated for the individual is a part of individuation, and sexuality, in fact, could not exist if the psychosomatic distinction of individuals did not exist. However, sexuality does not belong to the individual, is not its property, and requires the couple to have a signification. Sexuality is the pre-individual still linked to the individual, and is specified and dichotomized in order to be conveyed implicitly and psychosomatically by the individual. The dichotomy of the pre-individual allows for a larger integration of this pre-individual charge into the individual. Sexuality is more imminent to the individual than the pre-individual, which veritably remains an apeiron. Sexuality models the body and the soul of the individuated being, and it creates an asymmetry between the individuated beings qua individuals. Sexuality is at an equal distance between the apeiron of pre-individual nature and the limited, determined individuality. It establishes the inherence to limited individuated individuality, i.e. a relation to the unlimited. This is why it can be passed through in two directions, toward individuality and toward nature. It makes individuality and nature communicate. It is not true that sexuality is merely a function of the individual, since it is also a function that makes the individual step out of. It is not a specific function. Individuation is therefore bimodal qua individuation, and yet is precisely not an individuation completely achieved as individuation, because it remains concretely bimodal. There is a halt in the path of individuation that allows for this bimodality to conserve the inherence of a charge of apeiron. This translation of the unlimited into the limited protects the being from aseity and correlatively deprives it of complete individuation. In this way, it can be understood why this individual bimodality was able to be considered as a principle of dialectical ascension. Nevertheless, the myth of the hermaphrodite indeed remains a myth, for the hermaphrodite is bisexual rather than a complete individual. We can wonder if the rigorously unimodal individual can exist apart. In species where sexuality does not exist or is merely episodic for the individual, there are often gregarious forms of existence that mark a halt in individuation. With superior species, the adherence of sexuality to the individual being creates the inherence of a limit of individuation to the interior of the individual. Sexuality can be considered a psychosomatic imminence of pre-individual nature to the individuated being. Sexuality is a mixture of nature and of individuation. It is an individuation in suspense, arrested in the asymmetrical determination of the elementary collective, of the unified duality of the couple. So we start out here with this notion of the collective as the what do you call it here, the condition of signification. So there's only something like information in the proper sense of the term, insofar as there's a collective individuation between the transmitter and the receiver. There's something like so when you can think of like a telegraph message, I think is what he's sort of thinking of, this type of transmission, or a telephone communication or something like that. You have a transmitter and a receiver, but there's only something like information transmission in the proper sense, so something that can be incorporated into the functioning of the receiver, only under the condition that the receiver and the transmitter undergo some sort of process of collective individuation. And so this requires, of course, that they have this charge of the pre-individual within them or associated with them that allows for them to undergo a further process of individuation. And here he uses the term subject to refer to the ensemble of the individuated individual and the pre-individual reality. So we have the subject, which is the individual and the pre-individual reality, and then the individual, which is treating the individuated being as distinct from the associated pre-individual reality. So the subject and the individual are not synonyms. And then we have this short bit about language, which is language is, I think, a topic that Simondon says very little about, which is kind of surprising, given how interested he is in communication and information theory. But here he argues very briefly that language can't be taken to be the ground of signification. Language is something secondary. There has to be signification first before language can exist as something that allows for the expression of signification or the transmission of information. So we can contrast this with some other notions of language, like in Heidegger, the famous line that language is the house of being, and this sort of more general idea that language has some sort of fundamental significance. Simondon is not really interested in language, and he sees it as something secondary, and it's there has to be signification already for language to arise. And then we get into this bit about sexuality, which is something we've seen a little bit about before, but not just sort of in sort of brief passages throughout this part of the book, or the part on psychical individuation, and then here on collective individuation. And we'll see in a little bit that he's going to contrast this with Freud's doctrine, and he's done this before as well. But sexuality here is a sort of pre-individual reality that remains in the individual, or it's a sort of intermediate between the pre-individual reality outside the individual and the individual itself. So there's within the individual, their sexuality, sexuality is present within the individual. The individual is a sexuated being, but at the same time, it's something that sort of surpasses the reality of the individual being. And there's this idea of incompleteness that we saw in the last chapter earlier today. This idea that human beings are, in some sense, essentially incomplete, and here Simondon is taking sexuality as one instance or one example of this incompleteness, and he points to the myth from Plato's Symposium about how this idea that human beings were originally hermaphroditic, so that each individual human being, as we are today, is a result of a splitting in two of human beings that were originally hermaphroditic, and Simondon takes this myth as something like an indication of the incomplete nature of human reality in relation to sexuality, and how the individual is only completed in the couple. So it's only with another person that sexuality becomes sort of completed or realized in the full sense. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit, and we can talk about Freud a little bit. So if someone else would like to read from This Is Why Sexuality.
Yeah, I can read. This is why sexuality can be an introduction to the collective or a withdrawal. based on the collective, an inspiration and incitation toward the collective. But it is not the collective, and it is also not spirituality, but the incitation to spirituality. Putting the being into movement, it informs the subject that it is not a closed individual, that it does not have a satiety. There is sexuality, but it remains a metaxy and cannot be detached from the individuated being, since it is deposited in its modality of individuation. Unlike Freud, we cannot identify sexuality with the very principle of the tendencies in the individuated being. The being also cannot be divided into two principles, that of pleasure and that of the death drives, as Freud attempted when he reworked his doctrine and modified it after the First World War. Freud felt that there is both a unity and a duality of the individuated being, but the being can neither be interpreted according to pure unity nor according to pure duality. The difficulty of Freud's whole doctrine stems from the fact that the subject is identified with the individual, and that sexuality is placed in the individual as something that the individual contains and includes. However, sexuality is a modality of the initial individuation, rather than a content of the actual individual. It is organized or is not organized in its ontogenetic development with what we have called nature in the subject, such that it becomes individualized or, on the contrary, is linked to the world and to the group. Pathogenesis should be linked to a conflict between the modality of individuation in the form of sexuality and the charge of pre-individual reality that is in the subject without being included in the individual. But it is indeed certain that the fulfillment of desires, the satisfaction of tendencies, and the relaxation of all the tensions of the sexuated being do not harmonize the individual with itself, and do not halt the pathogenic conflict within the subject between the modality of individuation and nature. Neither the study of the individual alone, nor the study of social integration alone, can account for pathogenesis. It is the subject who is ill, not the individual alone, for there is within the subject a conflict between nature and the individual. The only path of resolution is the subject's discovery of significations due to which the collective and that which is individual can be harmonized and develop in a synergistic way. Goldstein appropriately remarks that the normal state of the drives is not resolution, flat calm, but a certain median tension that applies them to the world and attaches them to their object. The subject can find its fulfillment and its equilibrium neither in the pure individual facing itself and its given reality, nor in the insertion into the empirical social. Freud and Karen Horney have generalized two borderline cases. Mental pathology is on the level of the trans-individual. It appears when the discovery of the trans-individual is lacking, i.e., when the charge of nature that is in the subject with the individual cannot encounter other charges of nature and other subjects with which it could form a trans-individual mode of signification. The pathological relation to others is one that lacks significations and dissolves into the neutrality of things, thus leaving life without polarity. The individual then feels itself becoming an insular reality, improperly crushed or falsely triumphant and dominant. The subject seeks to link the individual being to a world that loses its signification. The trans-individual relation of signification is replaced by the powerless relation of the subject to neutral objects, some of whom are his peers. With fate analysis, Sandi has indeed found this aspect of nature that there is in the subject, but this aspect must also be found in cases where no definite pathogenic forces appear. There is still some pre-individual reality that has guided the subject in its positive choices. Indeed, choice is not merely the activity of that which is entirely individuated in the subject. Choice supposes the individuation of a part of non-individuated nature, for choice is the discovery of a relation of the being through which the subject is constituted in a collective unity. Choice is not the control of a neutral object by a dominant subject, but the individuation that intervenes in a charged pre-individual ensemble formed by two or several subjects. Choice is the discovery and institution of the collective. It has a self-constitutive value. It takes several masses of pre-individual nature for choice to be fulfilled. Choice is not an act of the subject alone. It is the structuration in the subject with other subjects. The subject is the milieu of choice as well as an agent of this choice. Ontologically, every true choice is reciprocal and supposes an operation of individuation deeper than a communication of consciousnesses or an intersubjective relation. Choice is a collective operation, a group formation, a transindividual reality.
So we see here again his criticism of psychoanalysis, and he raises 2 points, 2 different topics where he feels like psychoanalysis is sort of insufficient. So on the one hand, or the first point is that in psychoanalysis, he thinks that there's an improper assimilation of the individual and the subject. There's a sort of the way that Freud treats the drives as being part of the individual sort of minimizes the role of the pre-individual reality in the subject for Simondon. And then the second point is right. So it's this notion that or this argument that the drives for Freud, there's this idea of drives as seeking equilibrium, or a drive consists in a sort of tension that the subject tries to minimize or eliminate. And for Simondon, we instead have to think of drives or the pre-individual reality within the subject as something that has a sort of constant tension. So it's only through this tension that there's something like a relation to an object for the drives, and the condition of minimization of tension would be one of would be a pathological condition, would be something close to death, rather than being like what the drive is sort of aimed towards. So these are the 2 sort of criticisms that Simondon makes of psychoanalysis. This fate analysis that Sondi has developed, that Simondon points to here, is something I don't really know anything about. But yeah, this idea that it's one of the most discredited personality tests is kind of funny. I think personality stuff is in general pretty low quality in psychology. I think there tends to be like pretty it's hard to like make good sense of what it means to say that there's a difference of personality between people, and to make that like a rigorous distinction. But yeah, so I'm not sure what exactly Simondon is drawing from Sondi, or what he sees as being valuable in that. But I think there's something when he talks about the pathogenic pathogenic aspects or properties that appear in the subject, he's arguing here that the what is pathogenic is not strictly limited to the individual, but includes the individual's relation to the pre-individual reality within the subject that it forms. So there's the formation of a pathology of a neurosis or some other pathological condition has to do not just with the what's already constituted in the individual, but also with the pre-individual reality associated with them. And then we have this bit about choice, which is kind of obscure, I think, but I think it has to do with the reality, with the idea that in something like personality or there's a sort of choice of a personality or a selection of a personality out of a possible set of personalities, so that there's something like it's only a choice in the proper sense if there's something like a process of individuation that happens. So I think like when we think about choice in sort of standard psychological experiments, it would be something like, you have to choose whether to press the blue button or the red button or something equally meaningless. And for Simoneau, this is not a true representation of what choice consists in, because there's no actual process of individuation happening in this sort of minimal case. Yeah, and there's the idea of some sort of collective role in dealing with pathology. So dealing with something like a neurosis. I think this is something that we can point to other societies as having something like this in a way that ours doesn't really. So individual pathology in our society is treated precisely as individual pathology, as something that the individual is supposed to deal with in a sort of isolated way, whereas other societies have in relation to choice. Interesting. I was thinking of it in relation to the resolution of a neurosis, but I think both questions are connected in the sense that it's only because there's something like a collective in which the individual can undergo further processes of individuation that something like a resolution of a neurosis is possible. So if the individual were sort of left to its own resources, it wouldn't have this possibility of resolving a neurosis.
This description of the failure of signification, how he talks about how the individual kind of falls in on itself, sounds like the discussion of anxiety earlier.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think these are similar types of cases where the individual is sort of left to its own devices, rather than having a relationship with other individuals or with a trans-individual reality. And so in these conditions, they're sort of experienced by the individual or by the subject as being experiences that are painful and ones that you don't want to remain in. So there's this sense of isolation or of being left on your own as a sort of absence of signification, I think is one that human beings in general are not fond of, and that we tend to try to avoid. And so this is another side of that incompleteness of the human being that we've been seeing throughout this part of the book. We're just about out of time. Maybe we have time for one. Did we finish the subsection? Did we get to the end of the subsection or not? I can't remember.
Oh no, it stopped. I didn't realize it was.
Yeah, it was just one.
It was
paragraph.
just one paragraph. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's read that one paragraph and then see
Okay.
what comes up. So I'll read the last bit here. Thus, the subject more so than the individual is implicated in choice. Choice occurs on the level of subjects and involves the constituted individuals within the collective. Choice is therefore the advent of the being. It is not simple relation. It then would be more appropriate to study if there are modes of the pre-individual, i.e., the different aspects of nature that subjects include. The apeiron is perhaps undetermined only with respect to the individuated being. There are perhaps various modalities of the undetermined, which would explain why specific cases and specific tensions are required for the birth of the collective, and in order to have a certain number of chances of stability in all cases. One could perhaps define in this way classes of a prioris, impossible significations, categories of potentials, stable pre-relational bases. The concepts to carry out such a study are lacking. So yeah, he's suggesting here that this pre-individual reality might not be something strictly undetermined, but there would be some sort of determination of there would be different kinds of pre-individual reality, and there would be some sort of basis for different kinds of significations or different kinds of potentials that could appear in different individuals or different collectives.
I was kind of thinking maybe this could be an answer to the distinction between the different aspects of the trans individual. There's these different kinds of pre-individual shares, I guess, that create different kinds of collective.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. It's hard to say because he, like he says here, that the concepts to carry out such a study are lacking. Like he thinks that we don't have a way of talking about these different kinds of pre-individual reality, and I think this could be sort of related to what I was talking about earlier about how personality studies are pretty hard to perform in a rigorous way. So if there is something like a different kinds of pre-individual reality that sort of underlies the formation of different individuals, different personalities, and different collectives, then this lack of concepts would sort of make itself known through the difficulty of performing personality study in a rigorous way. Yeah, MBTI types or Enneagram. I like this thing about so there's something, the missing astrology link maybe, yeah. Yeah. That sort of brings to mind, there was, it's completely unrelated, but there was, at some point, I think it was in the 90s, there was someone who did a thesis, this woman did a thesis at a French university, trying to demonstrate that astrology was real, and it had all these like fake Einstein quotes in it and everything. Like,
Nice.
it was, yeah. So there was a big, like, when this became sort of public knowledge, there was a big controversy about the fact that she was able to get a PhD, like, about how astrology is real, which is kind of disconcerting. But yeah.
That's encouraging. If I've thought about maybe trying to get a graduate degree at some point.
Yeah, you can just use fake Einstein quotes and it'll be easy.
There you go.
Okay, so let's end here for today, and we'll pick up from page 348 next time. Let me write that down so I don't forget. Okay, so thank you, everyone, and we might be able to finish. Yeah, I think we should finish the chapter next time and possibly start on the conclusion. So we're. Oh, actually, maybe before we go, one thing that I was going to mention. I've been working on this translation of a text that may be of interest to, possibly of interest. There's these two French philosophers of mathematics, Albert Lotman and Jean Cavaillès. Lotman was someone that Deleuze cites pretty frequently in Difference and Repetition. And anyway, they did a joint presentation at the Société de Philosophie Française in 1939, and I've been translating that text. So their presentation and the discussion afterwards. So I was going to suggest, after we finish the first volume of Individuation, maybe we can take a break of like maybe 1 or 2 weeks to get through to take a look at that translation, and hopefully I can get some feedback if there's any points that are like not clear or something like that. If other people would be interested in reading that text.
Sure, that sounds great to me.
Cool. So yeah.
What's the name of the text?
The text is just called La pensée mathématique. So mathematical thought. But it's I can post the link to the French one, the French text, in the chat afterwards. Yeah, so we'll finish the first volume in the next couple weeks. The conclusion is a little bit long, so it might take a couple sessions to get through it, and then we can look at that translation.
Sounds great.
Cool. Okay, so
it's about mathematics.
Yeah, it's philosophy of math. So they have so Lotman and Cavaillès have sort of different approaches to philosophy of math, but Lotman is the one that I'm more interested in. He has a sort of Platonic philosophy of math. He thinks that there's in mathematics there's a sort of realization of a dialectic of ideas. So these ideas of like the whole and the part, or structure and existence. These ideas are realized in mathematical theories, and so he tries to show the presence of these ideas in different mathematical theories.
Interesting. That's a little Spinozist, yeah?
Yeah. Well, definitely Cavaillès is more Spinozist than Lotman, but I think there's a Spinoza connection with Lotman as well. But yeah, we can take a look at that in a couple weeks when we finish the first volume, and yeah, we can see how my translation holds up.
That sounds great.
And see you all next week.
See you too.